story of the Callahan family begins with a photograph no one in town will claim to have taken. It shows three people standing outside a weathered white farmhouse in the late autumn of 1934. Two women, nearly identical in height, hair color, and bone structure, stand on either side of a tall man whose face is partially obscured by the brim of a dark hat. The women's hands are clasped together behind his back, their dresses matching in every detail except for the faint discoloration where the fabric has been mended too many times. Locals will tell you that photograph was the only one ever made of the three together, and that even then it was destroyed not long after it surfaced. But its existence was proof of a story people had whispered about for decades, that the Callahan sisters had both married the same man, and that the tangled web of their shared lives had created a family tree unlike anything the county had ever seen. Their names were Lillian and Ruth Callahan, born just 19 months apart in the hills outside Clay County, West Virginia. The Depression had hit hard in the mountains, and the Callahan family was already poor before 1929. Their father, Thomas, kept the girls isolated, pulling them from school by the age of 10 and forbidding them from going into town without him. Neighbors would later say they saw the girls less and less as they grew older, their appearances limited to quick errands or church services where they were ushered in and out without conversation. By the time they were in their teens, it was whispered they spoke in a strange, clipped way, finishing each other's sentences, as though they were two halves of the same thought. The man who would connect their lives forever was named Henry Sutter, a newcomer from across the state line in Virginia. He arrived in 1933, claiming to be looking for land to farm, but in truth Henry had a history he didn't speak of, a failed marriage, allegations of violence, and a quiet reputation for knowing how to get things done outside the law. When he met the Callahan sisters, people said it was like watching a storm find two lightning rods. By early 1934, Henry was courting Lillian, the older by less than 2 years. Their marriage was small, unregistered by any official courthouse, and blessed only by a traveling preacher whose name would never appear again in the county. For most people, that might have been the end of the story. But by the following spring, something strange began to unfold. Ruth, the younger sister, started wearing the same style of dress as Lillian. She began walking into town with Henry when Lillian stayed behind. She was seen sitting beside him in the pew at church, whispering in his ear. And then, without warning, a second wedding took place, this time between Henry and Ruth, again officiated in private and without legal record. The preacher, who some claimed was the same man as before, disappeared from town immediately afterward. It would be easy to assume this was a matter of polygamy or lawlessness, but the truth was far more disturbing. Henry did not maintain two separate households, he kept one. Lillian and Ruth both lived under the same roof with him, sharing the same bed in alternating nights according to a schedule they devised together. They referred to themselves not as rivals, but as the wives of the house, and their arrangement was not a secret among those few who were close enough to witness it. What no one understood at first was that the sisters were not just sharing a husband, they were sharing children. By 1936, there were already two infants in the Callahan home, both boys. Their birth certificates listed Lillian as the mother, but neighbors swore that Ruth had been the one seen heavily pregnant the previous winter. Over the next decade, this pattern repeated again and again, pregnancies alternating between the sisters, though the father never changed. To outside eyes, the Callahan boys and girls were simply siblings. But behind the walls of the farmhouse, the lines blurred. The sisters raised all the children together, calling them ours, rather than yours or mine. The children themselves were told they had two mothers and one father, and that there was no difference between them. As the years passed, the web of relationships began to fold in on itself. The oldest children reached adulthood without ever leaving the property. When they married, it was often to one another's siblings, which, given the shared father, made them both half-siblings and cousins. The Callahan family tree began to look less like a branching oak and more like a knotted rope, looping back on itself until even the family members couldn't say exactly how they were all related. In some cases, the same person could be an aunt, a half-sister, and a cousin, depending on which path of the tree you followed. There were whispers of birth defects among the younger children, though in those days such things were spoken of only in hushed tones. A boy born without the ability to speak, a girl whose eyes did not align, an infant who did not survive the winter, his tiny body buried on the far side of the property without ceremony. Yet Henry, Lillian, and Ruth showed no sign of doubt in their arrangement. They claimed their bloodline was strong because it was pure, because it did not mix with the world beyond the hills. They discouraged their children from leaving, and when one son attempted to join the army in 1944, Henry made certain he was declared medically unfit. By the time outsiders began to take notice, social workers, census takers, traveling doctors, the Callahan family was already 3 generations deep in the same pattern. Two sisters had become the foundation for an entire network of marriages and births that defied traditional understanding. And while the world beyond the hills was moving on, modernizing, and expanding, the Callahans remained a closed loop, bound to each other by choice and by blood in equal measure. The first real fracture came in 1951, when a traveling photographer passing through the county spotted two women at the edge of the Callahan property, both in their 40s now, still strikingly similar, still dressed in faded matching cotton dresses. A group of children stood behind them, watching silently. The photographer asked if he could take their picture. The women agreed, but on the condition that he take it from far away, without stepping onto their land. That photograph, developed weeks later, would become the only surviving image of the Callahan sisters in their later years. A haunting tableau of a family frozen in time, staring out at a world they refused to join. What the photographer didn't know, and what would only come to light years later, was that by the time he clicked the shutter, the Callahan lineage had already crossed a threshold from which it could never return. The second generation had begun marrying within itself, sealing the family tree into a pattern that would produce some of the most complex and disturbing genealogical records in American history. And as the years wore on, it would become clear that what began as two sisters marrying the same man had become something far more sinister, a legacy written not in ink, but in blood. By the summer of 1928, the children from both sisters had grown into an age where even the youngest could no longer be called innocent in the eyes of the town. People had stopped asking which mother belonged to which child. It had become impossible to answer without turning the answer itself into an accusation. The children called both women Mama without distinction, and both women responded as though the
Subscribe to my
title belonged
channel.
to them alone. The man at the center of it all, Elijah Barrow, remained the quiet shadow in the corner of every photograph, tall and severe, his lips pressed thin in a way that suggested neither guilt nor pride, just ownership. In the earliest school records that survived, the family tree was drawn not like a branching diagram, but like a coiled spiral, looping over itself in a pattern that baffled teachers. A girl could be listed as both sister and niece to another student in the same grade. One boy, whose features matched Elijah's down to the slope of his brow, was recorded as both son and grandson to the same man. When a traveling census taker pressed the family for clarity, the sisters refused to answer. They claimed it was God's order and that the truth was not for paper. That year, the census records for their household were left conspicuously blank in several places, names scratched out, relationships replaced with the word relative. Whispers in town began to shift from gossip to fear. The midwife, who had attended most of the births in the Barrow homestead, suddenly left the county without collecting the last of her pay. In a rare slip to a neighbor, she admitted that she had seen a baby born with the eyes of one mother and the mouth of the other, and that she could no longer stomach the sight of it. When the local preacher finally gathered the courage to speak to Elijah, it was already too late. By then, two of the Barrow daughters were carrying his children, one of them barely 14, the other not yet 16, and both sisters, the wives, treated the situation as though it were an unremarkable passing of the seasons. Medical visits became rare. The family claimed they had no need for outsider doctors and relied instead on what they called the old remedies, handwritten recipes of herbs and prayers passed down from their own parents. A young county physician, Dr. Howell, was the last to be summoned to the property for a complicated labor. He would later confide in his personal notes that the child he delivered that night had fingers fused into claw-like curves and a jaw so narrow it could not close fully. The women in the house, he wrote, didn't weep, didn't pray, didn't even acknowledge the deformity. They simply wrapped the baby in a handmade quilt and placed it in a cradle beside two other infants who were its half-siblings and first cousins at the same time. By 1935, the Barrow family had grown to nearly 30 living members, all spread across only two small houses at the edge of the ridge. No one worked in town anymore. They kept to themselves, surviving off the land and occasional trades of furs and handmade goods. Outsiders who hiked too close to the property line claimed they heard children's laughter that seemed to echo in pairs, as if two voices were mimicking one another in perfect sync. A few swore they saw the same face in two different windows at once. When state welfare officials finally arrived in 1938 under orders to investigate child welfare violations, they were met with a wall of silence. None of the children would speak. The sisters stood shoulder to shoulder on the porch, their faces lined the same way, their hands clasped tightly as if holding each other in place. Elijah remained inside, never once stepping into the daylight. The officials left with only one child in their custody, a boy of about 9, underweight, and nearly blind from a congenital defect. But in an act that remains unexplained, the state filed no charges, no public report. The rest of the family stayed exactly where they were, as if the visit had been nothing more than a passing inconvenience. It wasn't until 1971, long after Elijah and both sisters were buried in unmarked graves on their land, that the truth began to resurface. A construction crew clearing the old Barrow property for development found a locked wooden chest buried beneath the floorboards of the larger house. Inside were dozens of sepia-toned photographs, each carefully labeled in the same spidery handwriting. The images showed children posed in stiff rows, their faces eerily similar, some so alike they could have been mirror images. In the corner of one photograph, half-shadowed, was Elijah's unmistakable profile, older now, but with the same unreadable expression. Among the photographs were birth records, some official, others handwritten, each one marking the mother's name and father's name in a way that overlapped so frequently it became impossible to follow the lineage in any straight line. In one particularly unsettling record, the same man was listed as father in 3 consecutive generations without a single outsider name appearing. The box and its contents were quietly turned over to the County Historical Society, where they sat in storage for decades. Then, in 2019, a graduate student researching Appalachian genealogy stumbled upon them. She recognized the names Barrow, McKellar, Price from scattered mentions in census data. Out of curiosity, she submitted DNA samples from preserved hair strands found in the chest to a modern lab. What came back was not just rare, but biologically astonishing. The results showed a level of genetic homozygosity so extreme that one individual was, genetically speaking, the equivalent of their own double cousin and a half-sibling simultaneously. In the margins of her report, the student wrote only one line: "The family tree is not a tree, it's a noose." A request for the records under the Freedom of Information Act was filed the following year. The county denied it, citing privacy concerns for living descendants. The denial only fueled more speculation. Locals claim that at least two surviving members of the Barrow bloodline still live in the area under different names, blending into small towns where no one asks too many questions. And though the ridge where the Barrow houses once stood is now overgrown with pine and bramble, hikers say they sometimes find small, carved wooden dolls in the underbrush, two women standing side by side, with a single man behind them, his hands resting on both their shoulders.